Hello and welcome to Dev Coaches Podcast. We are here with Steve Smith at DogFoodCon in Columbus. Wanted to sit down and get a chance to talk with him about the .NET Core progression that's going on with Microsoft, the conversion. And he had an opportunity to have some talks today on that. Wanted to talk to him about that and some of the other projects he's working on. So welcome, Steve.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So you had two talks today, on both on .NET Core?
The first one was a talk I've given a bunch of times. It's not really specific to a technology, and it's on improving the design of existing software.
Okay.
And so I've given that at a number of different shows and also for individual clients to kind of help teams combat technical debt and work with their legacy applications and keep them from becoming just big ball of mud apps that fall over under their own weight. And then my second talk this afternoon was on ASP.NET Core 2.0. Mm-hmm. And I kind of introduce .NET Core in general because it's a fairly big sea change for .NET developers, and then talk specifically about what's new in the 2.0 release that just came out about 6 weeks ago.
Excellent. And how much change is there in 2.0 from 1.0? I actually haven't gotten into 2.0 much yet, so I'm curious about the major changes. There
isn't a lot really that changes between ASP.NET Core 1.x and 2.0. Mm-hmm. There are some changes with how the project files are structured and how the startup and program.cs and the startup files work by default with the project templates. Mm-hmm. But the old stuff still works.
Okay.
Right? They basically just make it a little simpler by default. And if you're migrating something from 1.x to 2.0, the easiest thing to do is just create a new project in 2.0 that has the project file, the startup class, the program.cs, and then copy over all the rest of your files into it.
Okay. Actually, you mentioned the project file. I know with 1.0, 1x, I should say, the projects files had gone to a JSON format, and my understanding is they are no longer in a JSON format in 2.0. Is that correct?
Right. When it first shipped, everything was JSON, and before it shipped, when it was in the betas period, everything was JSON, and a lot of folks really liked that. And Microsoft ultimately had to abandon that approach because all the other things that Visual Studio works with that they wanted to integrate .NET Core projects with all use MS Build, and so the ASP.NET team had the choice of either integrating with MS Build or making it so all the other project types in Visual Studio could work with core projects. And they chose the former because the latter was an immense amount of work. The good news is that most of the reasons why folks really loved the JSON format wasn't so much that it was JSON as it was a lot smaller and simpler and much easier to work with from a source control standpoint than the CSproj files of .NET 4, let's say. And the biggest reason for that is that instead of having to list every single file and folder inside the project file that was part of your project, now the defaults just include all the files of a particular type in the folder. And you can exclude or include things using wildcards instead of having to list every single file and then have merge conflicts when two people change the same line of the XML thing by adding or renaming a file.
Okay, and actually that was the thing I was excited about most with the JSON. Right. Was the smaller, compact version. And so this is
the
good.
project files now, they start out around maybe 15 or 20 lines of code. I mean, they're really small. And even if you've got a big project with a lot of files in it, the biggest thing that's going to take up space in your project file is probably your NuGet packages that you're referring to. Another thing that is new in 2.0 that addresses that concern is in the 1.x timeframe, the ASP.NET Core framework is comprised or composed of a lot of different specific NuGet packages. And so in 1.x, you might have literally a dozen different NuGet packages for things like ASP.NET Code, ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core MVC, Entity Framework.InMemory, et cetera, et cetera. And now in 2.0, there's a meta package that you get. So you get the ASP.NET Core.all package, and it has a version. So starting out now, you'd get 2.0.0, and it includes all the other things that you might need. And when you go to deploy, it'll kind of do a tree shaking algorithm, figure out which of those packages you're actually using, and only include those. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. You're still getting the modularity of only depending on at runtime packages you're actually using, but at development time and in your project files, you only have to worry about this one meta package and not every individual little package that you might end up needing.
Excellent.
That's nice.
It is.
So for somebody who hasn't done .NET development for a little bit,
Pat's a Java instructor.
Well,
developer
I'm sorry.
for the most part. Yeah.
I did .NET stuff for a few years ago, right? And I haven't built anything with .NET Core. So I'm curious, how is it different just in general from the previous style of development, like with the MVC4?
Sure. So if you're just working at the level of app development and you're a web developer, you're familiar with MVC4, you know how to work with views and Razor and C# and controllers and actions and routes, pretty much all that stuff works like it used to. So you don't have to change much about the way you work. You still add actions, they still use views, they use the same conventions, and that is one of the benefits of ASP.NET Core is that most of the knowledge you already have, you can carry forward.
Okay.
Now, there are some new features. In ASP.NET Core, there's something called tag helpers that didn't exist in the previous versions of ASP.NET MVC. Tag helpers are similar to HTML helpers. They're a view technology. With an HTML helper, you had to imperatively run some code in your view. You had to say, at HTML dot, URL helper or whatever, and construct some HTML there with this static function call. In ASP.NET Core, you have tag helpers, and what they look like are HTML attributes. So you might have an anchor tag, like a less than a, and then you can say ASP-route equals, and then specify a route, and then put in the name of your label of your anchor tag. And at runtime, that ASP-route will get rendered into an href that maps to the route that you're specifying. And so when you look at the code, instead of having a bunch of like C# executable code in there, it just looks like a bunch of HTML attributes. And so if a front-end developer that doesn't know C# opens up that file and wants to add a CSS class to something, they can easily do it. Whereas with HTML helpers, sometimes even something as simple as adding a CSS class to like a drop-down list meant adding like a new anonymous C# class to do it. The syntax for it was kind of kludgy. And so that's another thing that's nice about this. It's a new feature.
That is nice.
What would you say your favorite new feature of Core is?
I'm real big on clean code and writing code that is testable so you can prove that it works. And so one of my favorite features is actually not specifically in ASP.NET or in MVC, but it's actually the test host that they ship. And so what the test host is something that will run your ASP.NET Core app in memory, and then it provides you with an HTTP client that you can use to execute requests against it. And this all occurs in memory as well. So a lot of things that cause pain when you're trying to do full stack web testing using tools like Selenium or even web tests in Visual Studio is the fact that they're slow, they have to go over the network. If your firewall isn't configured just right, your tests all don't work. A host of different issues with connectivity can make those tests brittle and hard to work. These all run in memory, and so once you get them working once, they tend to just work, and they're pretty straightforward. You wire them up using the same web host builder type that you use to configure your application in your actual web project, and then you can run tests against them, and you say, give me this request to that route, and it will execute it and give you back the response, and then you can, let's say it's a web API, you can deserialize it from its JSON or XML into a strongly typed, API model or DTO or whatever it is, and then write assertions and say, I expect that when I called this route, I would get this result. Where this is different from what you can do in .NET without Core is, you can unit test controllers in MVC today. But when you write a unit test against a particular action method, all you're testing is that method. And so if you want to test that the route works, that the filters work, that the error handling works, that the authentication works, usually none of that stuff is in that method. It's usually configured outside of the action method. You can't test any of that easily without a full web test, and those are brittle and slow and ugly. So you can test everything, all the stuff that has to do with your MVC app with an integration test or a functional test, if you prefer that term, using this test host. And they're fast and they're not brittle, and that's probably my favorite feature.
That sounds pretty neat. So it's like a mock web server. Is that what you're describing?
It's a test web server. Yes,
it's a test web server.
So
okay,
it's your web server running just like it would run in production. But this test host is something you can connect to in memory, and it provides you with the HTTP client to do so. So you don't even have to worry about configuring that or like figuring out what port is it running on or any of that stuff. It just works, right? It's got a property called getClient or something like that.
Yeah.
And it gives you the HTTP client to use to make requests to it.
That sounds pretty neat.
Yeah.
Now, is that available with the community version of Visual Studio?
It's available without Visual Studio.
It's available.
It's just part of ASP.NET Core. It's
nice.
You get it. It's just a NuGet package.
I was assuming it was an integration to Visual Studio, but that's nice.
No. Another thing that if you're not familiar with .NET Core and you've worked with .NET before, but now you're in the Java world, is that .NET Core is totally cross-platform, and you can do all the stuff you can do in Visual Studio. You can do from the command line interface. So there's a .NET command line interface tool that you can use to create new projects, to run your project. That's how you kick off the web server, typically in an ASP.NET app, ASP.NET Core app rather. You can run your tests. You can do all that stuff from the console, and you can do it from a Mac terminal, and you can do it from Linux. You can host it in a Docker container running Ubuntu, and it all just works. So
Nice.
I think that's one of the exciting parts of Core from what I've seen. I'm excited about that.
yeah, that part's definitely cool. And I've got a MacBook Pro, and it's nice that I can, especially in demos and stuff, I can flip back and forth and say, okay, here I am running in Windows, in Boot Camp, and then I can switch over and be on the Mac and do the same stuff and use Visual Studio Code or Sublime and a Mac terminal, and it all still works.
Are there any serious limitations between the cross-platform versions of .NET Core?
There are, and they get a lot better in 2.0. So another thing that I didn't really have much time to talk about in my session today is that in addition to ASP.NET Core 2.0 shipping, there's also Entity Framework Core 2.0, and more relevant to your question, .NET Standard 2.0 has shipped. And so the .NET Standard is not so much a set of libraries as an interface or set of interfaces. And different libraries implement that interface. And so the full .NET framework encompasses something larger than the .NET Standard 2.0 interface. But the .NET Standard 2.0 is a big interface that covers a lot of features, much more than the 1.x versions did. And what that means is if you are writing code to .NET Standard, some version, the .NET Standard can run cross-platform. And depending on which version you have, you've got a richer set of libraries that are available to you.
Okay.
And they're expanding that over time. So in the 1.x timeframe, you'd go against, you'd either code against the .NET Core runtime, or you'd code against like .NET Standard 1.1 or whatever. And it has a limited set of libraries and things that from the base class library that you could rely on. In 2.0, that footprint is much, much larger, and it should be very rare that you would run into something that wasn't in the .NET Standard library. Some examples of things that would be like access to the Windows registry. Well, that's just never going to be there because it's not cross-platform.
Right.
Right.
That makes sense.
So the web apps run on Linux and Mac too?
Oh, yeah.
Like the web server?
Yeah.
So you don't need IIS anymore?
Correct.
Oh,
It
that's
ships
nice.
with a web server called Kestrel.
Kestrel.
Okay.
And when you run that console app that is your ASP.NET Core app, it literally has a public static void main that you run, and the first thing it does is it creates a web host, and then when you configure that web host, you tell it to use Kestrel, or they also have hooks in there to work with IIS or work with.
So what I understand about that though is Kestrel is actually the web server, and when you use IIS, it's really just using it as a reverse proxy. Is that correct? Okay,
That's correct. Yeah, and they have they just changed the name of it, but they have another one, another server that I think they're calling. Don't quote me on this. What are they calling it? I don't remember at the moment.
We're going to quote you on that.
All right. Yeah, it's definitely called. I don't remember at the moment. But it runs the Windows server behind the scenes for that. So Kestrel's like a brand new thing that they've written. It's all open source. It's very fast. And the other one, I don't remember the name of it. I don't use it very often. I always use Kestrel. But yeah, if you use the IIS integration, it acts as a reverse proxy. So it'll come into IIS on the front end, and then reverse proxy that into Kestrel.
Why would you need that?
Well, with Kestrel, it was a new product, right? And it was written by the ASP.NET team. It didn't have the years and years of hardening and security and performance that IIS has had. Right. So they didn't want to recommend to customers, Microsoft didn't, that Kestrel should be something you would actually host your real web app on to the internet. So instead, what they recommend was you would put that behind IIS or Nginx or some other front end thing that was edge facing or internet facing, and then have that reverse proxy the request to Kestrel. Kestrel's great at handling requests, but they didn't want it out there exposed to attacks and things from the internet.
Yeah.
With 2.0, they're now fine with they've done the work with Kestrel where they're good with it being an edge facing deployment. So
I see.
In 2.x you can deploy on Kestrel.
That's fair. Yeah, Java went through the same kind of process.
Sure.
With a Tomcat and Apache, and lots of Java setups right now are set up with Apache in front of Tomcat. So I guess it is kind of the same thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So another thing I know that they've included in .NET Core is now integrated dependency injection. Now, some of the things I heard about that and I haven't had a lot of opportunity to work with Core yet. So But some of the things I heard about that in the first iteration, that it wasn't really mature. It couldn't do everything. Is that something that's improved? Is it first class citizen at this point?
I don't know that it's changed that much between 1.x and 2.0.
So are those the things that I've heard? Is that true? I mean, how mature is dependency injection within Core?
Dependency injection is like definitely a first-class citizen in .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. It's how everything in the framework itself works. So if you want to build an MVC app, you have to add the MVC services to your application so that they're available when your app runs. And you do that in just the same way that you add your own application services. It's part of what you do in startup. Now, it is true that the built-in services collection and iService provider doesn't necessarily have as many features and bells and whistles as some of the open source .NET IOC containers like Structure Map or AutoFac or things like that. But for most applications, and certainly for most new projects, it's good enough, right? It supports the things you would expect. The biggest one being that it has all the different lifetimes for the objects. So if you want something to be a singleton, you can just create it and say to the service container, create this as a singleton, or create this as scoped, meaning I want a new instance every time a new web request comes in, and when that request dies, those instances can go away, and I'll get a new one with the next request. Or transient, which means anytime anything asks for one of these, give it a new instance.
Excellent. So, I mean, I think that's been a good discussion on Core. So tell us a little bit about some of your other projects at this point. What other things are you up to?
What was the first talk you did?
So the first talk was on improving the design of existing code. It talks about refactoring and technical debt. It's a popular talk that I've given at a bunch of conferences and for clients.
What kind of suggestions do you make?
It covers some background principles and things that you want to consider, like heuristics. So it talks about cyclomatic complexity. It talks about different kinds of technical debt that you might encounter, whether it's reckless or prudent or inadvertent or planned, and things of that nature. And then I go through a bunch of specific examples for things that are examples of repetition or violations of principles like single responsibility or Liskov substitution or other solid principles. And I talk about a bunch of different specific refactorings. I don't cover all of them. I have actually an 8-hour course on Pluralsight on refactoring fundamentals that talks about all kinds of different code smells and how to address them. But this kind of opens the door to that and also helps the heuristics thing, like specifically cyclomatic complexity. I show how you can use Visual Studio or other tools to quickly narrow down in your code base, where are the biggest messes of code where the most complexity lives. Those are the places you probably want to focus your efforts on as far as refactoring, more test coverage, more code reviews, things like that, because they're going to tend to be where the bugs hide.
Excellent. Did you have any other questions on?
No.
So some of the other projects you're working on. Tell us about what else you have going on.
So I've got a new podcast I just started. I've been doing a weekly email newsletter for about a year and a half.
Yeah, I've been subscribed to that, so I get that every week.
Great. Yeah, and that's just like weekly dev tips. So I took that. And I recently heard another podcast that I really enjoyed, which was by Jonathan Stark, and he's on value pricing and talks about hourly billing versus value pricing. And the thing I thought was really interesting about his podcast was that the episodes were like sometimes 5 minutes long. And I was like, oh, well, shoot, I could do a 5-minute podcast. Right? And there weren't any guests, and there wasn't all this. When I think about a podcast, I think about, I've got to have a co-host, and I've got to have a guest, and I've got to have all these things, and I've got to talk for an hour. And so it was never something I really thought I could fit in. But, 5 minutes of me discussing a tip, I can manage to fit that in. So I've started this weeklydevtips.com podcast, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher now. And you can fit it in between your other podcasts because it's usually 5 to 10 minutes long.
What's this week's tip?
This week I actually skipped, but the most recent one right now is on guard clauses and how you can use guard clauses to reduce the complexity in your code and make it simpler to fail fast out of your application and then just have the happy path of your code be the part that is the main focus of a given method.
What do you mean by guard clauses?
So a guard clause is where, let's say you have an application where you want to know whether or not something is valid. Right? You've got some inputs. You want to check whether or not they're null. You want to make sure your string is not empty or has a value.
Right.
And so you might write some code that says, well, if this thing is not empty, then next check and make sure it has a value that's valid. And now after that, do the thing that you actually came here to do.
Right.
Else throw this one type of exception, else throw this other type of exception, right? And so now your code is this nested if mess of complexity, and it gets worse the more parameters you have and the more things you have to check. And if you look at where your actual code is that you want to run, it's relatively deeply nested and indented in your code base. If you use a guard clause, what that means is that you're going to immediately check the inputs for whether or not they're valid, right? Let's say whether they're null. And then if they are, just throw an exception right there. And what that does is it makes it so that you're failing right out of the code without any if checks, right? So there's no need for any if complexity. Your cyclomatic complexity stays low. And once you have checked each parameter, then whatever's left must be valid, right? And so the rest of your code can just run. And you don't have to worry about else clauses or anything like that. You can take this one step further, and you can use a library that already has a bunch of known guard clauses, and actually have a NuGet package out there called guard clauses. And it has things like guard against null or empty, guard against out of range, and you just call that and pass in the variable, the input parameter that you're testing against, and then it will throw the exception for you, and that works fine because the exception will just bubble up from that helper to your method and then out of your method.
So is this is just like a technique?
Yep, it's just I didn't invent it.
No.
It's a technique that I've found valuable, and it works well for keeping your code clean and not having as much of your code filled up with plumbing code trying to validate inputs or throw exceptions.
Makes sense. It makes it easier to test too.
Yep.
Because you tear apart all the validation out of it.
Right, and it makes it less repetitive, right? You're not checking for null, and maybe different developers test for null different ways, right? One of them is going to say, well, if null equals this, or if this equals null, and depending on your programming language, sometimes that can have a different behavior.
That's true.
So, saying, guard dot against whatever being null, that's going to all be in one place, right? So you can go look to one location that is how you check for null in your application, and it makes it much cleaner and more consistent code.
It sounds very nice. It's good.
Excellent. Yeah. So you have the weekly Dev Tips podcast now.
What's the URL?
Yeah. What was the URL again?
It was weeklydevtips.com.
How about that? Yeah, that's excellent. I know you have a bunch of courses on Pluralsight. I know you've done some domain-driven design with Julie Lerman, I believe.
That's right.
As well as the other one you mentioned, and some others, I believe, as well.
Yeah, I have about 10 courses out on Pluralsight. I have a course on Solid that's very popular, and so if you want to learn more about Solid principles, I highly recommend that. I have a couple on N-tier architecture with C#. I've got one on pair programming that I did with coworker Brendan Enrick, where we of course are pairing in the course of that course. And then most recently, I've got a course that's not on Pluralsight. It's actually on a startup that I'm a co-founder of called DevIQ, and that's where my ASP.NET Core Quick Start course is actually hosted. So you can go to ASP.NET Core Quickstart.com or just go to deviq.com and you'll find it there.
Excellent. And you also mentioned that you have a free ebook that you've written.
Yeah, Microsoft actually commissioned this. So it's Microsoft's ebook, and it's available out on Microsoft.com/net/learn/architecture, I believe. And so I have an ebook and also a sample app that goes with it, which is on architecting ASP.NET Core applications with Azure. But you don't have to use Azure to get the benefits of most of the book. There's like 2 chapters at the end on Azure, and the rest of it is like, how do you write a clean architecture? How do you use ASP.NET Core, dependency injection, testing? A lot of those concepts are covered in this. It's about a 130 or 140 page PDF, and then there's a sample that goes along with it.
Excellent. Well, Steve, it was really a pleasure to have you with us today. And, you aren't very far from us up there. We're in Akron, and you're in Hudson.
Yeah.
We need to get together and do this more often.
We record in Akron all the time. You should come down.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
And we talk about somewhat ridiculous things sometimes. So.
Sometimes they're ridiculous. Sometimes they're not.
You guys could come out to Hudson SC sometime, the Hudson Software Craftsmanship Group.
Yeah.
And then, we've got Tech Hub Hudson is a co-working space over in Hudson. So I don't know how many of the listeners might be in the area, but if they ever need a place to work with fast bandwidth and, free refreshments, they can look us up.
Excellent.
Sweet.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for listening to the Dev Coaches Podcast. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit devcoaches.com and on Twitter @devcoaches. We'll catch you next time.